Hello everyone. In this session, we want to talk about the DHCP service, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. When you install the DHCP role on a domain controller, that domain controller will automatically use the DHCP service to give out IP addresses and other TCP services to client computers on the network. If your server is a domain controller and you install that DHCP service, that server will automatically be authorized to give out addresses. However, if you install the DHCP role on a server that is a member server, means that a server that is not a domain controller, then you actually have to authorize that server within Active Directory to allocate IP addresses. We want to look at the process of allocating IP addresses. We're going to look at 4 steps: the discover step, the offer step, the request step, and the acknowledge step. You have your client computer here. The client computer is turned on, and the client computer says, I need an IP address. I cannot communicate on the network unless I have an address. So the client computer looks to the DHCP server for that address. The DHCP server has a pool of addresses. This pool of addresses is referred to as a scope. So one of the things that you want to do as soon as you install the DHCP role is to create the scope of IP addresses, because the clients will need that scope in order to get an address. So let's get back to step 1. The client comes on and the client says, give me an IP address. The DHCP server in step 2, which is the offer stage, will say, let me check my scope to see if I have an address that I will give you. So the DHCP checks for the address. It finds an address and it says to the client, I found an address. Will you accept the address? Step 3, which is the request. The client says, yes, I will accept the address. Can you kindly give me that IP address? Send it to me. And also send the remaining configuration that I will need to communicate on the network. Step 4, acknowledgement. The server says, okay, I am going to send you this IP address. So this IP address is assigned to your client machine. So here we have a domain controller, and the DHCP server role is installed on this domain controller. The DHCP server will automatically be authorized to allocate the IP addresses to members of that same domain. And again, if that role is installed on a member server, we actually have to go and turn on that authorization. Let's take a look and see how we would do that. We are on our server manager dashboard. So we want to go into DHCP. We're going to click on Tools, DHCP. You want to expand the domain. And we want to right click on the DC. So right click. And we see that the server is already authorized because it's a domain controller. If we were to unauthorize the server, I'm going to click on unauthorize. And we are now removing authorization for the server from the directory. And if the server is not authorized, then the clients will have a problem getting IP addresses. But we're going to go ahead and remove it anyway by clicking yes. Now we want to go back to the dccontoso.com, right click, and we now see that we can authorize. So let's get this straight. If your server is a domain controller, it will be authorized when you install the DHCP role. And then when you right click on the server, you will see unauthorized, meaning that it's already authorized. If you are installing the DHCP role on a member server, this is what you will see here. After the installation, you have to come to the server, right click, and click on authorized. And only then will the server be authorized to give out or allocate IP address information and other TCP settings that the client will need to communicate on the network. After the DHCP server role has been installed, you will need to configure the DHCP service by creating a scope before the clients can get addresses. Now, a scope is a range of IP addresses on the particular subnet that are selected for allocation by the DHCP server. So before you create your scope, you should already know how many addresses you want to give out. You should know the IP range that you want to give out. You should know how many addresses on your server you would like to allocate to servers or to printers. So you should have that knowledge beforehand. To create the scope, we want to expand Contoso. We want to right-click on IP version 4 and we want to say New Scope. The wizard is going to help us configure the scope. So we click Next. And we want to type a name for the scope. We're going to call our scope Contoso West. And you should always put in a description for the scope so that another administrator that's working on this server will understand what Contoso West will do, the addresses that it comprises of, and what it actually points to. We want to click Next. And we now want to put the range of IP addresses that we chose for this network. So we're going to put 192.168.5.2, and our ending IP address is going to be 192.168.5.100. So we have a range of addresses from 2 to 100 that can be allocated to clients. We see in our pane below that the subnet mask automatically gets configured for the Class C network. So that's right. And we want to click Next to continue. Exclusions. You need to exclude some of your IP addresses because you need static IP addresses for your servers and your printers. You don't want the DHCP server to be giving out those addresses because the DHCP server will give out addresses, but the addresses will change when the lease expires. And we want the addresses for our servers and our printers to be permanent or static addresses. So we have to manually configure those. So let us tell DHCP not to give out a certain range of addresses automatically because we need them to use for our servers and our printers on the network. So the range that we want to exclude will be 192.168.5.2 to 192.168.5.20. And we simply click add here to add that exclusion range. So the range, that range from 2 to 20 will be the IP addresses that we will configure manually on our servers and our printers or any other node on the network that needs a static address. Here we have the subnet delay, and the subnet delay is a delay in the time duration by which the server will delay the transmission of the DHCP offer, and you can give a little delay on that if you want, or you can leave it at 0. For our lesson, we're leaving at 0. So we want to click next to continue. And here we see that we have the default lease duration, and it is 8 days. If you have mobile systems on the network, you can shorten that lease duration, or you can also lengthen the lease duration if you're dealing mainly with desktop computers at a fixed location. So if you have mobile systems, you can shorten that lease. Desktop computers, you can lengthen that lease. We're going to leave it at 8 days, and we're going to click on next. We now have to look at the other DHCP options besides the IP address that the clients will need. We want to configure those options later, so we want to click on No. I will configure these options later, and then click next to continue. At this point, we're going to need to activate the scope. So we want to click on Finish, and we can see our scope here in the left-hand pane, and it has a red arrow icon here that shows that it's not activated. We want to right-click on the scope and click on Activate. And we see that the red arrow is now gone and the scope is activated, and we can see it because it now has a blue icon. Let us take a look at some of the scope options. The Windows DHCP server supports two kinds of options. You have scope options, and the scope options supplied are only to the DHCP clients receiving addresses from a particular scope. Whereas we have the server options here, and the server options supplied represent the options given out to all addresses from the server. All DHCP clients receiving addresses from the server. So you can set the options at the scope level, but that will be only for a particular scope that you create. Or you can set the options at the server level, which means all of the clients, all of the scopes that are configured will receive the server options. The router option is a typical example of a scope option because a DHCP client's default gateway address must be on the same subnet as its IP address. So let us look at configuring that router option. On the scope options, we want to right-click on scope options and then click on configure options. We can see that the router option here is 003 We want to click the checkbox to the left of the router option. And here we can type the server name, the DHCP server. And we're going to type the server name as Contoso. And we're going to add the IP address of that server. And we're going to click on Add. We can also configure the DNS name server. Here we can click on the tab for the DNS name server, and we can type the address of the DNS server. We're going to type 192.168.5 and 10, and we add in the address of the DNS server and all the addresses that we type within the scope. Clients within that scope will receive that information. Once they turn on their computer, they will connect to the DHCP server and receive that TCP and IP information from the server. Remember that you can also create these options at the server level. They're the same options, but what is the difference? The difference is that the server options will be for all the scopes on the network. Again, whereas the scope options will be for a specific scope that you are creating the options for. At this point, we want to click Apply. And we can see here that we have the router address and we have the DNS server address. We want to take a look at reservations. In Windows, DHCP server, a manually allocated address is called a reservation. You create a reservation by right-clicking on the reservation node here and then selecting New Reservation. If we, for example, wanted to put a reservation address for a printer, what we would need would be the MAC address for that printer, and we are reserving that printer, giving it a manual or static IP address. It means that we don't want this address to be changed. We want this particular printer, this particular system to have a static IP address which we reserve by putting the MAC address of that printer. By doing that, we're saying that this particular printer, or if it were a node, will have this particular IP address reserved for its use only. You create the reservation by clicking, that is right-clicking on the reservation node, and then from the shortcut menu, you want to click on New Reservation. And you will see that the dialog box opens up, and you want to give a name for the reservation. So let's call this name Printer B. And the address that we want to give that printer is 27. So that's 192.168.527. What we will need to do is we need to actually put down the MAC address of that particular printer. So we have to do a configuration of that printer, print out the configuration page, and find the MAC address of that printer. If we were on a computer, we would do an ipconfig/all, which will show us the MAC address of the printer. We're going to type the MAC address of the printer. And we're going to click on Add. And we can close the reservation box unless we want to create a new reservation. Reservations create a permanent record of the IP address assignment on the DHCP server for a particular node on the network. We have looked at creating a DHCP scope. We have looked at creating an exclusion range. We've looked at creating a reservation. And we also looked at configuring scope options for the router and the DNS server. In our next session, we want to take a look at configuring PXE and deploying a DHCP relay agent. This is the end of our session, and I would like to thank you for listening.